How did the idea for street parties come about?
When planning the anniversary and thinking about what I was going to do on the anniversary of Joe's murder, I wanted it to reflect who Jo was. And she was somebody that had this sort of amazing enthusiasm and zest for life. She loved sort of getting together with her community. So that was one bit. And then the other bit, and probably the more important piece, was Joe's killing was designed to divide communities. It was driven by hatred, and it was about trying to pull us apart. And I could think of no better response to that than a moment that actually brings the country together, that shows that our country, with all its diversity and all its difference, actually has more in common than the things that divide us. That, you know, that was the stuff that Jo talked about.
Were you inspired by the number of events that were taking place?
Absolutely overwhelmed by it. And I think where that comes from is, you know, as a country, we spend so much of our time talking about the areas we disagree with each other, and that's fine. That, you know, that's a really important bit of living in the type of open and free society that we do. But it's also really important that we find moments of togetherness and actually to celebrate those things that unite us, which are much more important than the other things. And I think what we've tapped into, and I think why it's sort of taken off, it's obviously partly because of Jo and people's feelings and compassion of the linked to that, but I think it's something more fundamental about this desire for togetherness and bringing our communities close together. I think we all want to live in closer communities, and I think we're at a stage where some of our communities are fragmenting a little bit, but you can't just wish that you live in a closer community. You actually have to do something about it. So we just hope that the Great Get Together is an excuse to do just that.
A year on from the incidents of last June and Manchester and London Bridge, they've shown that people can come together, and we've seen great acts of kindness and generosity. But there's been a dark side as well. Hate crime has gone up and people aren't reporting it to the authorities. How can we promote understanding among people of different backgrounds and faiths?
You know, I think what extremism has at its core, whether that is Islamist inspired or fascist, Nazi inspired, as it was in the case of my wife, what they have at their core is the same thing, which is both a fear of others and a hatred of others. Whether they hate non-believers or whether they hate people that aren't white British, that hatred has never defined our country and it never will define our country. And I think we all have a responsibility to drive that out to the extremes within our own communities.
Among some Muslims, there is a feeling that somehow they are being seen as more responsible for failing to stop such perpetrators. What will you say to them?
One of the things that I hate seeing in response to events like Manchester or London is those who almost sort of prey on those events to drive their own hatred, who try to cast an entire community and say this is the responsibility of the community rather than the individual that did it. I said at the time of the Westminster attacks that the person that committed those attacks was no more representative of British Muslims than the person that killed Jo was representative of white men from Yorkshire, and that's true. Having said that, you know, I think we do all have both a responsibility within our communities to address hatred in all of its forms. Like I think there's very few of us who will come across a terrorist, and if we did, I think the vast majority of people would report them. But lots of us will come across attitudes which are informed by and driven by hatred. It might be misogyny, it might be homophobia, it might be Islamophobia, it might be anti-Semitism, it might be racism. And I think all of us have a responsibility to challenge that, and to take that on in our own communities. I think that's how we drive this out. And then the other piece, which I think is incredibly important, is that sense of togetherness. The way that we will defeat extremism is by building closer communities, by getting closer with our neighbours, by knowing each other. It's easy to hate people in the abstract. It's very hard to hate people when you know them. And so just how we do that better as a society to build closer communities, I think that's the response to all of these types of events.
What would you say to those who've lost their loved ones in circumstances similar to yours? How do you tackle and navigate through the grief? And is it possible to make sense from the rationality of events such as the Westminster Bridge and Manchester attacks?
Yeah, I mean, I think firstly I'd say that I'd be quite wary of giving advice because I'm still in the very early stages of it, and it's a year in, but it could have happened a month ago. Still unbelievably fresh, and I haven't. I wouldn't say that I have dealt with it, or I'm still dealing with it. It's very active. But in terms of advice, the stuff that's helped me, I guess, in this period. I think a big bit for me was about the kids, and having the kids was both some of the most difficult elements because it was where the pain was greatest, thinking about what they will miss. But it's also the sort of the stuff that gets you out of bed. I mean, they get you out of bed physically in the morning, but it's the stuff that keeps you wanting to live life and to have a good time and to regain that enthusiasm and zest for life that Joe had. So I think the focus on the kids for me helped a lot. And then the other sort of big piece of advice that I found very useful was just about trying to be open about it and keep talking about them, not sort of locking it away, keeping them present. Again, particularly for kids, is really important so it doesn't become a taboo. An openness with the emotions that you're feeling.
What would you like Joe's legacy to be?
I think that Joe had an incredible sort of set of interests and a very varied set of interests. So everything from loneliness in older people, which was a really big focus for her, through to addressing the conflict in Syria and protecting civilians in the war there, to women in public life, to bringing communities closer together. And we've set up the Joe Cox Foundation in order to keep those going. We didn't want her death to stop or set back the causes that she believed in. So we're absolutely focused on that and making sure that all of those strands that she worked on continue to advance. I think on a more sort of personal level, I do think that Joe's zest for life, her appreciation of and commitment to community and bringing communities close together, particularly given the way that she died, I think that if we can have as part of Joe's legacy actually communities getting closer together, building stronger communities, breaking down the difference between us, I think that would be a very powerful legacy for her.